the cherub and the Virgin Mary, the Buddha and the garden gnome, all the garden statuary talked in spring of how things grow. Buddha said from compassion, Mary said the Lord above. Gnome replied it must be magic, cherub sighed it must be love. And it rained then in the garden, and they all stood round and witnessed in stillness and listened to that lovely sound. Then St. Francis in the corner spoke up at the gathering. Peace, he said, is most important. Peace for all the living things. And the stars burned, and the earth turned, and the sun shone down. And they knew then in the garden life was stirring in the warming ground. And St. Francis stood entranced as cherub watched beguiled. Gnome's hands lay on his sharp spade. Mary gave thanks and Buddha smiled.
This is the question I've been sitting with. What do the commitments of my life, what do the commitments of your life tell you about the nature of the ultimate, of the ground of being? This is our theme of the month. We're talking about commitment. What does it mean to be a people of commitment? And I'm wondering today, not about so much those things we say we commit ourselves to as the commitments that are revealed through how we live our lives. All the true vows, says the poet David White, all the true vows are secret vows. The ones we speak aloud are the ones we break. All the true vows are secret vows. The ones we speak aloud are the ones we break. When you look at how your secret vows have shaped your life, what your life reveals about your commitments, what truth is to be found there? There's a quote we attribute to Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of our great spiritual ancestors, that transcendentalist, Unitarian, rapscallion, left the church, that we honor anyway as one of our saints. A person will worship something, he supposedly said. It's probably somebody else. We've lost the authorship in the dustbin of history. But a person will worship something, have no doubt about that. That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will determine our lives and our character. Therefore, it behooves us to be careful what we worship, for what we are worshiping, we are becoming. Today, I want to tilt that idea a little bit, see it from another angle. When we look at what we have been worshiping, what do we discover our lives teach us about that which is worthy of worship? What, if we will worship something, what is it that if we see what we have worshiped, what we are worshiping, we learn about the holy? Paul Tillich was a theological powerhouse of the 20th century. He was born in Germany in the 1880s. He flourished as a professor of theology at Union and at Harvard and finally at the University of Chicago. And his works of systematic theology in the 1950s influenced practically all theology that has been written since. And one of his most acclaimed books is The Courage to Be. And in it, he describes a theology that rests in the power of God being about resisting non-being. That the power of God is the resistance to non-being. Like many theologians, modern theologians, he's wrestling with how to talk about God in a way that doesn't deny scientific understanding and rationalism and doesn't rely on a personification of the divine. Here's a passage of his. Bear with me. There's going to be some dense language today, but I hope it's worth it. I've taken the liberty of changing Tillich's pronouns for God for ease of hearing for us. The being of God, he writes, the being of God is being itself. The being of God cannot be understood as the existence of a being alongside others or above others. Can't be understood as an existence of a being alongside others or above others. If God is a being, she is subject to the categories of finitude, especially to space and substance. Even if she's called the highest being in the sense of the most perfect and the most powerful being, this situation is not changed. This I love. When applied to God, superlatives become diminutives. When applied to God, superlatives, the most perfect, the most powerful, become diminutives because he says they place her on the level of other beings while elevating him above all of them. Many theologians who have used the term highest being have known better. Actually, they have described the highest as the absolute, as that which is on a level qualitatively different from the level of any being, even the highest being. Whenever infinite or unconditional power and meaning are attributed to the highest being, it has ceased to be a being and has become being itself. Not a being, but being itself. Many confusions, he writes, in the doctrine of God, and many apologetic weaknesses could be avoided if God were understood, first of all, as being itself, or as the ground of being. Not a being, but the ground of being. I wonder if you were among those garden statuary that Peter Mayer sings of. What is it your life would speak about how life grows, about what the soil that is the ground of being is made up of? Buddha said, from compassion. Mary said, the Lord above. Gnome replied, it must be magic. Cherub sighed, it must be love. Assisi said, what's most important? Peace for all the living things. What is it your life speaks about how life grows, about what the soil that is the ground of being is made of? Hold to the truth you make every day with your own body, continues David Whyte. Hold to the truth you make every day with your own body. Don't turn your face away. Hold to your own truth at the center of the image you were born with. Those who do not understand their destiny will never understand the friends they have made, nor the work they have chosen, nor the one life that waits beyond all others. What does my life tell me about the ground of being that I am committed to? I think about the choices at the grocery store, all the daily choices, what energy to use and how much. Think about commitments we shape our lives around, about families and work, the secret vows we make of how we will be with one another, of who we will be for one another. The choices we make when we face into chronic illness or the process of dying. Think about devoting ourselves to care for parents who can no longer care for themselves, for months that sometimes become years. Or setting boundaries and holding tender hearts that fret over whether we have done enough. I think of all our hope of making a difference, our commitments to vocation, to a calling, perhaps finding only once we are waist deep in it that the reasons we told ourselves we chose our work were only a benevolent mask while we waited to understand how our work had chosen us. And I think about the causes we choose, the moments we find, the people we band together with to participate in the healing of the world. Our commitments, our choices. What do our lives tell us about the ground of being? The ground of being we are already committed to. 56 years ago today, on March 7th, 1965, about 600 people left Brown Chapel Church in Selma, Alabama, to march to Montgomery. You know this story, demanding access to a right they should have already been guaranteed, the right to vote. They were viciously attacked that day on the bridge by state troopers, viciously attacked on a day that came to be known as Bloody Sunday. Precipitating clergy from around the country to rally to the local community's call for support. Clergy including my grandfather from First Presbyterian here in San Anselmo, including the white UU minister James Reeb, whose murder 2 days later awoke the conscience of a nation that had slept through countless murders of Black activists, especially that of Jimmy Lee Jackson, which galvanized the March 7th march. I remember writing about that moment, about those events in my application to seminary, thinking about the role of people of faith and religious leadership in turning the world toward justice. I was trying to name something about what I knew was a commitment shaping my life, a commitment telling me something about the shape of life itself. Howard Thurman, another of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, and one of Dr. King's mentors, one of the spiritual springs of the civil rights movement. He wrote a book in 1963, just a couple of years before that Bloody Sunday, titled Disciples of the Spirit. Disciplines of the Spirit. And in the first chapter, Commitment, he writes that at the core of life is a hard purposefulness, a determination to live. There's something dogged and irresistible about the methodical way life pounces upon whatever may be capable of sustaining it, and will not release it until its own sustenance is guaranteed or fulfilled. This is a quality of life, he says. A simple but dramatic illustration can be seen by any observer in the world of nature. He says the roots of trees spread out in many directions, always seeking the ground of existence for themselves. Then he shares a story that many of us will know, and certainly Jim Harrison's seen quite a bit of on our land, of those roots and trees just grasping for life and wreaking havoc on the pipes and sewer lines that we lay under the ground. But they won't be stopped. That's his point. This life, this energy, this force. He describes this commitment to survival as a fundamental characteristic of life, an organizing principle, not unlike Tillich's idea of God's power residing in beingness, in resisting non-being. But rather than commitments being something to make and strive for, Thurman suggests they're an organic expression of life's aliveness. He says when the conditions are met, sustenance for the process of life becomes available. Because a fish has gills, it cannot get its oxygen neat, but must extract it from the water. A person takes their oxygen neat because they've got lungs instead of gills. Precisely what does this mean, he asks? Where the conditions for the release of vitality are met, the vitality becomes available, and this is automatic. That is, to the observer, it seems automatic. If we were to fully understand what is at work, we might find it to be some special kind of consciousness. Who knows? Jesus, he says, referred to the earth as being automatic. It brings forth of itself. In any case, when a seed is planted in the soil, if the seed is healthy and the conditions of soil and climate generally satisfactory, then it sprouts. Life becomes manifest. There seems to be available to the seed at a point in time all the energy and vitality it can accommodate in its unfolding. I won't keep going, though Thurman does. He works and draws the metaphor out lovingly, but the gist, I imagine, is already clear. Like the seed, our commitments to vitality, aliveness, survival, our own flourishing and unfolding, these are inherent within us. Our wholeness, our worthiness is a given, requiring only the right conditions to arise. But then he wrestles a little bit more with this idea of commitment. That commitment means, he says, that it's possible for a person to yield the nerve center of their consent to a purpose or cause, a movement or an ideal, which may be more important to them than whether they live or die. The commitment is a self-conscious act of will by which they affirm their identification with what they are committed to. The character of their commitment is determined by that to which the center or core of their consent is given. There is a choice to be made here. What is true for plants and animals other than people seems to be true for people. There are many complexities, he acknowledges, as we observe the pattern at the level of mind, but they must not confuse the basic elemental fact. When the conditions are met, the energy of life is made available. And referring to Jesus again, he relays that God makes his sun rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the just and the unjust. Sun rises on the evil and the good. Rain falls on the just and the unjust. We seem to be in the presence of a all-comprehending rhythm. There is a logic and an order in the universe in which all living things, at least, are deeply involved. Not unlike, I think, the understanding of love as a fundamental force that we were talking about last week. And while we may make commitments that run contrary to life, Thurman offers the faith that even though an evil enterprise, I think of all those who seek power as power as an end unto itself, even though an evil enterprise may generate its own vitality and energy, ultimately the evil enterprise will not be sustained by life for the simple reason that it is against life, he says. So there's the kicker I find in Thurman's reflections. When we contemplate the ways that life has responded to our commitments, given nourishment to the seeds we make of ourselves, we discover not only the shape of our commitment to the ground of being, but the shape of its commitment to us. I have been disappointed desperately at times by this universe that has not lived up to promises I imagined it to make to me. And I've heard these disappointments from others. I've sat with people who are angry, livid with a God they do or do not name for the way life has unfolded. Weren't we promised that if we were good, if we tried hard and said please and thank you, embraced morality and abided by the social order, weren't we promised to be sheltered in some way? Protected from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. One of my favorite poems always comes up for me this time of year, preparing for Passover, for Pesach that begins at the end of the month. In Lynn Unger's vision, the Israelites are wandering the desert, looking back at the time in Egypt that they then despised with a longing, pretending, she says, there was safety in the old familiar. But the promise, she writes, from those first naked days outside the garden, the promise of that ground of being, the promise made to each of us, is that there is no safety, only the terrible blessing of the journey. You were born through a doorway marked in blood. We are, all of us, passed over, brushed in the night by terrible wings. Ask that fierce presence whose imagination you hold. God did not promise that we shall live, but that we might at last glimpse the stars brilliant in the desert sky. And here we are a year later, still journeying through the wilderness of global pandemic, still passing through a doorway marked in blood, 2.5 million deaths and counting around the world from COVID-19, 500,000 of those in our country alone. God did not promise that we shall live, but the seeds of our being are planted in soil that affirms our commitments to life. We feel our spirits nourished as we reach out with kind notes, as we assemble on Zoom to demand housing protection for the most vulnerable among us. We grow even through a pandemic in the soil of this good earth. Grown that soil itself in the good soil of this wondrous cosmos, may our lives speak the truth of what we are made of. And St. Francis stood entranced as cherub watched, beguiled. Gnome's hands lay on his sharp spade. Mary gave thanks, and Buddha smiled. Maybe so. And amen.